What I mean by more commercially focused colleges, and colleges have always had to understand where the sources of funding come from, but predominantly they were coming from public sources. I think what I mean by this is a greater awareness of the revenue and different sources of revenue for a college and the costs of those activities that then generate that revenue. And what I mean is also understanding the risks associated with each one of those sources of revenue and obviously with those costs. And that acumen, that commercial acumen, not just being in the finance team, but right across the whole of the organisation, including the teaching staff, the support staff, as well as our managers and leaders. In terms of looking at becoming a more commercially aware and focused college, I'm really suggesting a very simple four-stage process. And that process starts with a clear understanding of, if you want, the pressure for the change, the reasons, and particularly what's happening in the external environment that's creating that drive for change. Secondly, to have a clear vision or ambition for that change. What's this commercially focused college going to look like, or the more commercially aware college look like? And thirdly, what are the sort of capabilities of the institution in terms of its staff, its culture, its leadership, its management, and obviously in terms of its organisational structure. And then converting all of that into a clear set of what I'd call actionable steps, in an action plan, dealing with those issues that are most immediate and having a clear view of how we're going to do it. In other words, doing what we need to do to become more commercially focused. The pressures for change, and this is more about looking at the external environment rather than sort of internal navel gazing, are predominantly coming from changes in government funding, particularly reductions, the need for institutions to look at alternative sources of funding as those public sources start to diminish, looking at the opportunities provided by the freedoms and flexibilities, looking at the changes that are occurring in the marketplace in terms of apprenticeships, funding by people being funded by loans, and having a clear appreciation of what the opportunities and threats are associated with those pressures for change, including things like the opportunities provided by devolution, local commissioning of work, and also looking at what might occur in terms of organisational structures through mergers, through federations, as well as a really good understanding of how the competitors are behaving in the markets for learning. So these are all pressures for change, which I think will need and require the organisation known as the college to make an appropriate response. I think the second part of the process is absolutely critical, is what is your vision as an organisation, as a college, of the change that you'd like to achieve or you'd like to be? What ambitions have you got in terms of being less reliant on public funding and perhaps having those alternative sources of funding, whether it be through an apprenticeship levy or loan-funded letters or other sources, in a clear view of what and ambition of what that might look at. Now that might also mean a clear view of what being economically and commercially resilient means. So I think it's about using all of the opportunities and being aware of the threats created in the first part of the process to then have a clear view of what you want to look like. And that in particular is what is the brand and the brand values associated with a much more commercially focused institution or college. And I think that has got to underpin all the behaviours of all the people in that organisation. So that's what I mean by a clear vision for change. What is a commercially viable institution look like? What does a commercially focused and aware institution looks like? And what do staff with commercial acumen look like as well? And have that as a clear set of drivers for all our behaviours. In terms of being able to respond to the pressure for change and achieve that clear ambition or vision, and remember there are some contradictions here, because for some colleges that might set up some conflicts, some dilemmas in terms of, for example, being responsive to the community. Having a wide and broad curriculum doesn't necessarily always go with being commercially successful. So I think in terms of being able to respond, the institution has to have a clear investment strategy First of all, in the sort of what I'd call the processes and the systems that allow you to become more commercially focused. And that includes, for example, skills training and staff training to do it, and maybe the appointment and recruitment of appropriate staff. But also, it's much deeper. It's about what culture, what mindset is in that organisation and how to change that mindset. And that's very much about a medium to long-term strategy in terms of developing managers and developing leaders. And in particular, have you got the governors with the right skills, with the right attitudes to take forward your institution to being more commercially focused and more commercially aware. So there's a lot of what I'd call investment strategies that look at not only the people side of the equation, but also, is your estate, do your buildings, does your accommodation allow you to become more commercially focused? And do you have the right partners to work with? For example, it might be needed to change your organisational structure internally, creating, for example, a more effective sales function. Or it could mean merging with other organisations, partnering with other organisations. So these are all things that are going to improve the capability and capacity to make the change that's needed to become more commercially focused. I think the last part of the process, and this is, by the way, it's a process that goes back and forth, it's, what's the terminology, iterative, is that you have to have a clear then view of where you're going to focus your attention on first. Say you've got a 3-year strategy. What are you going to do in quarter 1? What are you going to do by quarter 6? What are you going to have achieved by quarter 12 in terms of your action plan? Focusing on those things that you can focus on most immediately that will make the big difference. For example, if part of your strategy is to become much less dependent on public funding and more dependent, for example, on loan-funded provision or on levy-paying employers paying you, then employer engagement strategy might be the first point of call. That could involve, as a first stage, employing an appropriately trained sales staff, as well as obviously looking at some of the changes you might have to make to the curriculum. For example, you might have to focus on fewer standards or fewer frameworks as opposed to having the breadth that you currently have. So those steps have got to be the ones that deliver the greatest impact and the greatest change, but at the same time they've also got to be measurable, so you can start to see how that bottom line is changing and how those other aspects such as skills, attitudes and culture are also changing. So I think clearly focusing on 1 or 2 key areas such as employer engagement, or for example how to engage more effectively with loan funded learners would be a start point, and then you can achieve also those quick wins which have the greatest impact but also maybe the easiest to implement.